Hello and welcome to ThePrint. This is Bidisha and you're watching Economics. We are just a few weeks away from the Union Budget 2026 and once again, one phrase will dominate the discussion: public capital expenditure or public capex. Over the past decade and especially since the pandemic, the Indian government has taken on a very specific role: the investor of the first resort. When private companies were repairing balance sheets, when banks were cautious, and when uncertainty was high, the state stepped in. It built roads, railways, ports, power networks, logistics hubs. In effect, public capex became the government's favorite growth lever. And to be clear right at the start, this strategy deserves credit. At a moment of deep economic disruption, it stabilized growth and prevented a much deeper investment collapse. But as we approach Budget 2026, it's time to ask a harder question. Is public capex still delivering the same economic payoff it once did? My answer is a nuanced one. Public investment is still working, but it is working less powerfully than it did before. And crucially, it is no longer generating the kind of demand signals that typically trigger a broad private investment cycle. This is what I would like to call India's capex paradox: big public spending but shy private investment. Let me explain to you how public investment still crowds in private investment but less than earlier. Let's start with what the data actually show. Economists often talk about something called crowding in. In simple terms, it means that when the government invests, say by building a highway, it reduces costs and risks for private firms, encouraging them to invest as well. Think of it like this: if the government builds the road, private firms are more willing to build the factory next to it. Now, when we estimate this relationship using national accounts data, the results are very clear. In the pre-pandemic period from 2011-12 to 2018-19, the relationship was strong. A 1% increase in government capex was associated with roughly a 0.7% increase in private investment. That is textbook crowding in. Public investment was not replacing private investment, it was activating it. But when we look at the post-2019 period, the picture drastically changes. The elasticity falls to about 0.54. What does that mean in plain language? It means public capex is still supporting private investment, but each additional rupee of government spending now produces smaller private response than it earlier used to. Public investment has shifted roles. Earlier, it was the spark. Now, it seems to be more like a crutch. This is not a failure of policy. It reflects diminishing marginal returns from using the same instrument for too long in a very different economic environment. Now the question is, why hasn't strong public capex tightened industrial capacity? Now here is where the story gets more interesting. If public investment were decisively reviving demand, we should see it show up in capacity utilization. Capacity utilization simply tells us how much of existing industrial capacity is actually being used. When factories run closer to their limits, firms are forced to invest more. So tighter capacity is the classic signal for a new private capex cycle. But when we look at the data, that signal just isn't there. This is despite huge swings in public capex growth, including years of double-digit increases. In fact, when we plot public capex growth against capacity utilization, the relationship is weak and if anything slightly negative. In simple terms, more government investment has not really translated into factories running significantly hotter. And that tells us something very crucial. Public capex has expanded supply capacity, but it has not generated enough final demand to pull manufacturing into a self-sustaining investment cycle. This disconnect explains why private investment has recovered in such a patchy, uneven way. Yes, some large firms have invested, especially those with strong balance sheets and exposure to infrastructure or even regulated returns. But across much of manufacturing, firms remain cautious. They are focused on deleveraging, cost control, and efficiency, not aggressive expansion. Now, the question is why? There are three structural reasons for it. First, the composition of public capex matters. Much of the recent surge has gone into large infrastructure projects, highways, rail corridors, logistics parks. These are productivity enhancing, but they have long gestation periods. They don't immediately create demand for manufactured goods. Second, consumption growth has been uneven. Rural demand has only recently begun to recover. Urban consumption has been skewed towards services. Wage growth remains quite patchy. Without strong and predictable consumer demand, firms don't feel compelled to expand capacity, even if the roads are excellent. And third, uncertainty continues to weigh on private investment. Global demand is volatile. Trade rules are shifting, regulatory and tax unpredictability still affect risk-adjusted returns. Public capex can reduce costs, but it cannot eliminate uncertainty. So the question is, what does all of this mean for fiscal policy? Let me be very clear. This is not an argument against public investment. India still needs infrastructure. Pulling back on capex would be a big mistake. But the era where simply increasing public capex could carry growth on its own is ending. Budget 2026 needs to pivot from capex as a substitute to capex as a catalyst. That requires 4 shifts. First, public investment must be paired with demand supporting measures. Employment generation, urban demand support, and income growth are very essential if capacity created is to become capacity used. Second, the government must reduce policy uncertainty. Stable taxation, faster dispute resolution, predictable trade policy, and sector-specific regulatory clarity matter as much as infrastructure quality. Third, public capex should increasingly focus on de-risking private investment, not dominating it. Viability gap funding, PPPs, and targeted credit guarantees can crowd in private capital far more effectively than direct state spending alone. Finally, fiscal policy must recognize its limits. Public investment can build roads and railways, but it cannot really manufacture confidence. India's public capex push played a very vital counter-cyclical role when private investment was unwilling or unable to step up. It stabilized growth, it repaired infrastructure gaps, it bought time. That phase is largely complete. This next phase is harder. It requires restoring private risk appetite. And that will depend less on how much the government spends and more on whether firms believe demand will be durable, policies predictable, and returns worth the risk. As Budget 2026 approaches, the question is no longer whether public capex should remain high. It should. The real question is whether fiscal policy can now do what public investment alone cannot. Create the conditions for private investment to take the lead. Public capex has carried the economy this far. It cannot carry it the rest of the way all alone.